This video was part of a series of videos about political philosophy. Last time we got started in that series with a look at Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, and now we're going back in time, all the way to 400 BC, looking at Plato's Republic. So where King was asking questions about what legitimizes the state, when we have a duty to disobey it, and he develops an answer saying we have a duty to disobey the state when its laws are unjust. And he also implies we have a duty to respect the state and the laws when its laws are just. Well, these questions about why the state deserves to exist and what justice is, we can see these questions being asked here in Plato's Republic as well. So let's get to it. Now, Plato is considered one of the key figures in the history of political philosophy, largely because of this work. So we're going to look at the main question being asked in the Republic. We'll talk about the city-soul analogy and how that might help us think about a just state and justness in a person at the same time. And then we'll also spend some time looking at some of Plato's ideas about education and freedom of speech. So, for those of you who don't know, Plato was around from about 428 to 347 BC. Significant thing that happened in Plato's lifetime is that the Peloponnesian War was taking place. And after the Peloponnesian War, basically Athens was humbled after losing a war, even though they were considered a significant power. They came to be ruled by a terrible and tyrannical government for a couple of years, from about 404 to 403 BC. So as Plato grows older, he begins to write these incredible texts, which end up being like founding texts for the history of Western philosophy. Plato was a student and follower of Socrates, who was a philosopher in Athens at the time, but who didn't write anything. We know about Socrates because Plato wrote dialogues where Socrates is the main character, right? So Socrates was eventually basically put to death for impiety, that is like disrespect to the gods, and also for corrupting the youth, because Socrates was basically modeling a way of asking embarrassing questions to people in power in Athens. The youth started following Socrates, Plato among them, and Socrates ended up being sentenced to death for this. Now, Plato would not only write these great texts, but he also founded an institution called the Academy. And the Academy is considered to be basically the first higher education institution in the Western world. So more or less, Plato can be seen as, an inventor of what we might think of as a university education. So here's the central question that comes up in Plato's Republic. We're diving right into Book 2, but in Book 1, the discussion comes up, is the life of justice the best life to choose? Should I be just? And the question here is basically, should I pay my debts? Should I lie, cheat, and steal and be unjust? Or should I tell the truth and pay my debts and not steal? Living this life of justice, we might think. And a way to ask this question, and which comes up right at the beginning of Book 2 of the Republic, we can look at justice as both intrinsically and instrumentally good. So we can think of it as something that's useful for securing benefits, but also worth having for its own sake. Now we get a nice analogy here. What's another thing that we might think of as both intrinsically good, that is worth having for its own sake, and instrumentally good, worth having for the other things that it gets us? And Socrates suggests that another thing like this is our senses. So our ability to see, we might think of as something that we delight in for its own sake, but it's also something that's good for us because it's useful. So we might think of, the ability to see as both intrinsically good and instrumentally good. But there are some things that are only intrinsically good, and we might think of things like innocent pleasures. Right? So the pleasure that I get from drinking a sip of coffee, well, that's not making my life any more convenient or making the world a better place in some other way, but that moment of gustatory pleasure is a valuable thing for its own sake, right? And then there are other things that are only instrumentally good, right? So we might say that these are things that are only worth having for securing benefits that the thing brings with it. The example that Plato gives, and which I think might resonate with some of you, is that exercise is only instrumentally good. When we exercise, depending on the exercises, it's a bit of a chore. It's not always fun or pleasant, but we do it because we know that it will keep us strong and functioning. As somebody who's dealt with back pain, the stretches that I do aren't necessarily fun to do just for their own sake, but because of what they bring, keep doing them. Now, here's the setup. Socrates thinks that justice is this. It is good in and of itself and good for its own sake. But many people see justice, keeping your promises, not lying, not cheating, not stealing, as only instrumentally good. We might think of justice as a certain kind of chore that you continue to follow through on, but if you could get away with not being just, you would choose to be unjust. So this is the conversation that Socrates is having. Should we be just? And can we see justice as not just good for the things that it gets us, but good for its own sake? Right? And Socrates is engaged in dialogue. So in Book 1, he meets with this character named Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus tells us that a life of justice is actually a foolish thing to live, because justice is basically whatever those in power prefer. And so justice is just what is beneficial to those who are strong. Now, Socrates goes on to make an argument and says, well, this idea that the beneficial could be injustice, Socrates eventually argues against Thrasymachus that this doesn't make any sense, that only justice can be beneficial. And eventually Thrasymachus gets angry, says that Socrates has put words in his mouth, and then storms off. Right. And then this brings us to Book 2. So in Book 2, Socrates is speaking with two men, Glaucon and Adeimantus. So Glaucon tells us that justice is a compromise and that we'd be better off being unjust if we could get away with it. And this leads us to what's sometimes known as the Ring of Gyges story. So the idea is that the ancestor of a guy named Gyges once found a magical ring and learned that by turning the ring inward, he was able to become invisible. We might imagine, what would you do if you had an invisibility ring? And the way that Glaucon imagines it and recalls in the story of Gyges, well, basically the person with the invisibility ring chose to basically murder the king, seduced the queen, and became king himself, and then ruled over the land. Everybody thought that he was a good guy, but actually was getting away with all kinds of terrible stuff. And Glaucon says, if you had such an invisibility ring, you too would end up choosing the life of injustice rather than justice. So that's one sort of suggestion that we should look at justice from perspective 3, right? Justice is a chore, and the only reason why people don't act unjustly more often is because they can't get away with it, right? You could think about examples from your own life, right? Don't we realize that, groceries get stolen more often the more often that self-checkouts are used? Or you might have heard, and you might know some people who will just do their writing assignments using an AI, right? Because they know that there's a good chance that they might not get caught, right? So justice is a compromise, and he says that the people who try to tell you that you should still act justly even if you can get away with injustice, these people are naive or just not rational. It's more or less Glaucon's suggestion. And we get a second suggestion. Adiamantus, the second person in conversation with Socrates, tells us that if you go to the poets, justice can be characterized as a chore. And Adiamantus also points out that there's no guarantee that the gods will punish injustice in the afterlife. So if you go to Greek mythology, the thought is, well, maybe you can lie, steal, and cheat. But then as you are leaving this life and you're going to go down to Hades, you might sacrifice a goat, or you might sacrifice a pig. And this sacrifice that you might make could be a sufficient bribe, basically, to have the gods let you off scot-free. So not only do we get this thought experiment of the Ring of Gyges, but Adiamantus basically tells us that the stories and myth that we engage with are also suggesting that to do justice is an inconvenience, and maybe it might be smarter, more rational, a better and more efficient way to get the things that you want to just act unjustly. So, interestingly, Socrates says, wow, Adiamantus and Glaucon, you have given me some good challenges. And it's going to be hard to tell you what justice is and why you should live the life of justice. But here's a fascinating move that Socrates makes. He says, is the nature of justice easier to see not in individual persons but in something else? And he gives an analogy here. He says, if you have poor eyesight and you're trying to read something, wouldn't it be great for you to learn that you have a similar thing, you have maybe like the same book or the same serial number you're trying to read in larger print? So, instead of trying to read the serial number in that tiny microscopic print on the back of your laptop, why not go to the box where the letters are 3 times as large, right? Or if you're trying to read a passage out of the Bible, you might have a little free Bible with, little tiny 5-point font. But if you had the same Bible in the same translation with giant font, wouldn't it make sense to look at the lettering in the big thing first? And Socrates says we can actually do something kind of like that when we start thinking about justice. So if there was something at a larger scale that also had the quality of justness and unjustness, couldn't we look at that? And this is where Socrates sort of shifts the conversation. And he shifts the conversation from the question of what it is for a person to be just to the question of what it is for a city to be just. We might say we use the word justice to talk both about persons and their behavior. This is a just person who acts justly. But we can also talk about a city. This is a city that behaves justly, and there is justice in this city. It is a just city. Right? So as Socrates puts it, I will tell you, we speak of justice as residing in an individual man and also residing in an entire city, don't we? Justice may exist in larger proportions in the greater subject and thus easier to discover. So the fascinating thing that Socrates is doing here is he's saying we can answer the question of what good justice is to us by looking at the question of what good justice is in a city. So now, not only are we talking about our personal behavior, but we can also think about the dimensions of what a just political organization would be, or as the ancient Greeks will sometimes refer to it as the polis, right? And this strategy of argumentation that we find in the Republic, the city-soul analogy, is a key move in understanding the overall argument in Plato's Republic. But where does Socrates go with this fascinating move? Well, first thing he says is, well, why do we have cities in the first place? And he says, well, we form a city due to the fact that we are not individually self-sufficient, but we have many wants. And we could start thinking about the question of what are all the things that a human being wants and needs? And we might say, well, a human needs food and dwelling and clothes, right? And once we start to think about this, we might say, look, we cannot get all the food, dwelling, and clothing that we need simply by acting alone. You could think about a lone wolf or a hermit living out in the woods. It would actually be a very difficult way to secure all these needs. And we might think about the fact that given that we live in groups, we live in society, we can leave it to some people to import our food, to build our houses, to make our clothes. So that's the first thought. We have many people doing different things, and Plato suggests, through Socrates, that there will be division of labor in our city. So each person should do one job, and they should learn to do it well. So if we're going to get good at building houses, that should be the main thing that you do, right? And if you're going to get good at making clothes, that should be the main thing that you do. And people will sort themselves into different occupations based on what their aptitudes are. So some people will just be better at cooking. Some people will just be better at building houses. And we will find a division of labor where each person does one job and learns to do it really well. So we're going to need things like artisans and farmers and builders to meet our basic needs. That's the first idea of why we would ever bring a city into existence in the first place. And now Socrates has us imagine what a city designed to do this kind of thing would be like. And he imagines a city with an agrarian lifestyle, and they live in prudence and moderation to enjoy simple pleasures. So here's just a really fascinating and wonderful passage. Socrates says, in this city, will they not produce corn and wine and clothes and shoes and build houses for themselves? And when they are housed, they will work, in summer commonly stripped and barefoot, but in winter substantially clothed. They will feed on barley meal and flour of wheat, baking and kneading them, making noble cakes and loaves. These they will serve up on a mat of reeds or on clean leaves, themselves reclining the while upon beds strewn with yew and myrtle. This is basically leaves. And they and their children will feast, drinking of the wine which they have made, wearing garlands on their heads and hymning praises of the gods in happy converse with one another. and they will take care that their families do not exceed their means, having an eye to poverty or war. In other translations, more or less this translation says, the people in this city will enjoy sex with one another, but they won't enjoy it so much that they have more children than they can handle. Right? So this is a life where we live a simple farming lifestyle. We get enough food to eat, and we enjoy simple pleasures, like folk songs around a fire, basically. Now, it's interesting. After Socrates gives us this picture of what it might be like to live in a simple city that meets our needs, Glaucon objects, there's no dessert in this city. And Socrates says, well, we'll have some dessert. There'll be figs and honey. But Glaucon still says this city lacks delicacy. It lacks the kinds of comforts that they were enjoying then in Athens. He basically says that if you were designing a city to basically fatten pigs for slaughter, you would make a city like this one, right? And Glaucon says, so we want more out of our city. We want proper furniture. We want a nicely built couch and table rather than just reclining on mats of leaves, basically. So basically Socrates says, okay, we'll build your city instead, right? Not a steady, stable, healthy city, but as Socrates puts it, we'll make a city with a fever. And what does this feverish city have? Well, it's going to have not just simple desserts of figs and honey, but it will have pastries, right? We'll have properly made furniture, high art, professional performers of drama and opera, let's say. There will be professional musicians. In fact, not only will there be pastries, Socrates imagines, but there will be things like prostitution, that in a city where people want more than just their simple needs met, eventually we have this sort of feverish, consumptive city, and a city that addresses more human desires. Right? So as we expand this city, painting, embroidery, gold, ivory, we need more professions. Right? So not just carpenters, but we'll have smiths and other artisans. We might not be eating the simplest food, but we'll be eating luxurious food. So we'll need cowherds and shepherds and haulers and weavers and shoemakers and merchants and navigators and wage earners, poets, musicians, rhapsodes, actors, dancers, doctors. When we're not living a simple life, we're going to need more jobs within the city. And of course, we'll also need more resources. If you want things like gold in your life, we're going to have to do more trade, and we're going to have to attain more resources and land in the process. And Socrates and Glaucon basically admit that this will end up requiring a city to go to war. An army will be needed. And if we accept the assumption from just a little while ago, 2 slides ago, we will need people who are professional soldiers. We might say that protecting the city is one of the most important jobs, and we agreed that in order to do a job well, you need time to specialize in just that. So we're going to need professional soldiers. They sometimes get referred to as guardians by Plato. And this is really interesting, that if we're going to have guardians, they need to be spirited enough to be brave. That is, you need to have enough passion. You have to have enough fire in your belly in order to go into battle in war, right? But we don't want people who are just full of fire in their bellies, as it were, because those people are going to be getting into fights all the time. So we also need them to be gentle. Now, this is sort of the conundrum. Does it make sense to think of a person who's both a fighter and gentle? We might think that those are opposite qualities. So the need for these guardians is perhaps impractical because it's asking for the kind of person who seemingly doesn't exist. But Socrates and Glaucon and Adiamantus all admit to themselves that it actually does seem like people like this exist, people who are brave enough to go into battle, but who aren't getting into fights with everyone. So you have these opposite qualities of spiritedness and gentleness. And what Plato will suggest here is that our guardians need to be discerning. In fact, they suggest that to be discerning is to be a lover of knowledge and to have your actions and behaviors guide your spirit. And insofar as knowledge is guiding your passions, we can start to think that the soul doesn't just have one simple part to it. And eventually, Plato will develop this idea that the soul, in fact, has multiple parts, 3 parts. Not only does it have reason, but it also has spirit and appetite. Right? But once we start to see that your spirit has to be guided by your knowledge, we can start to see that the soul isn't just a simple thing, but that it's a divided thing. Now, one thing that I'll invite you to reflect on is if we need many parts to the soul doing different things, we also see that in the city, which we see in the city-soul analogy that is so central to Plato's Republic, that within a state or a city we'll also have different kinds of individuals playing different roles, and that knowledge should be guiding over passion, not just within the individual person, but also within a state. Right? But within our guardians, we will need them to have this dual role of being both spirited and guided by reason. And this leads to an interesting ending conversation in Book 2 of the Republic, where we start thinking about the relationship between education and censorship. Because we ask this question, how do we ensure that the guardians are sufficiently spirited yet also gentle? Well, here's how they ask it. Adiamantus, shall we permit our children without scruple to hear any stories and receive into their souls opinions, generally the diverse of which we think that they ought to entertain when they grow up into manhood? And basically they say, no, we shall not permit that on any account. More or less, as those designing the city, we must make sure that young people are exposed to the right information at the right time. And in this way, not only do we restrict what children are being exposed to when, but the city will also ban stories that characterize the gods as bad or unjust or imperfect. So, for instance, we get many stories within Greek myth of, Uranus fathering Cronus, fathering Zeus, and all of them are spiteful, vengeful, cruel individuals in many ways. Well, Socrates and Adiamantus agree that if we want to raise people with good character and not be misunderstanding of the goodness of God, then we would want to ban these stories of imperfect and unjust gods. And towards the end of this discussion, they say, well, what do we do? Well, basically, if the wrong message about the gods is being written, then we just won't let those plays be staged in our city, right? And in this way, we might start to see that even though there's a lot that might feel familiar or agreeable in what Plato is reflecting on, we also see this way in which some of it can be quite different from our own intuition and maybe alien to our belief that freedom is an important and fundamental value within the political realm. It seems to me that freedom plays little role in Plato's account of the just city. For those of you who read on in the Republic, for instance, in Book 8 of the Republic, we find it said that too much freedom is a bad thing, right? That a society with too much freedom will basically devolve into a tyranny, Plato argues. So I'm just going to preview a little bit that happens later on in the Republic. Socrates will go on to develop what is sometimes called a tripartite, that is a three-part account of the soul. I hinted at this earlier, that the soul has a rational, a spirited, and what we might call an appetitive part. The idea is that your appetites just happen to you. Hunger is just there, and you also can't reason with it. Spirit is somewhat responsive to reason. So, for instance, you might be fearing something, and once it's explained to you and you really internalize the fact that it can't hurt you, that might reduce your fear. So it's these rationally responsive emotions that we might look at as spirit. And just like a city has three classes, or just like the soul has three parts, the city will also have three parts and three classes within it. So we'll have a philosophical ruling class, the auxiliaries who are responsive to reason, but who are able to passionately guide the city with action. And then there are the workmen, the non-rational types. And within this theory that Plato is developing, one way to think about a just city is one where each person does the right job for them. Because we want to think of a just city as a city that is functioning well, where everything is doing its part, where everything is in its place. But on that view, we might think of the philosophical and rational ones as having an entitlement and a responsibility to rule over those who act and those with passion and appetite. But every individual within the city will be doing their part. But if we understand that a just city is the one where those with reason rule over those with passion, that's also true of a just person, right? So why be just? Well, it's because a just soul has each part of your soul doing what it's meant to be doing. And in a just soul, you find harmony. So that's the theory that eventually gets built up in Plato's Republic. So here are the main takeaways that I want to just re-emphasize as we finish up. For Plato, we can think about justice within individual persons as well as in cities and states. And in fact, we see a really fascinating back and forth. We can learn how to be just as an individual by thinking about a just city, and sometimes we can even think about a just city by thinking about what a just individual is like. For instance, we can think about how the city might have different groups with different roles in it by thinking about how in a guardian you need reason and discernment to manage spiritedness. So yeah, the city will have different parts playing different roles, and this city-soul analogy is central for understanding what Plato is doing in the Republic. And to bring this back to political philosophy, why does the state exist? What justifies the existence of, it might be a polis like Athens, but it might also be, like an entire country, like these United States of America. So our living together in a city or state, for Plato, seems to be a rational response to the fact that we are not individually self-sufficient, and that we need cities in order to cooperate and to benefit from the differing talents, aptitudes, and natures of different people. And in this way, we might also notice that if harmony is what we're focusing on, freedom is less important than development of character and placing people into the roles that they are suited for. So I hope you found this discussion of Book 2 of Plato's Republic enlightening and interesting. But that's where we're going to end for today. So as always, thanks for listening in. And if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't be shy about reaching out to me. All right. Take care. Keep reading. Keep thinking hard.